Okay, great. Good to hear from you guys. So I, Nancy Walton, am zooming from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, in particular the Kwantlen and Katzie First Nations, and today that's known as Maple Ridge. This is a webinar and you'll not be able to turn on your mic or video. You'll only be able to see the panel members or the speakers. And if you have a question for our presenters, please write them in the Q&A and I will ask them. The Q&A works a little better than the chat because as I answer the questions, I can get rid of them and that way we're not going to miss things because there's lots of stuff written in them. If you have any comments, you can put that in the chat or the Q&A, it doesn't really matter. We're going to have a lot of sections. Elizabeth has set this up so that every few slides, she's going to have a question period. And so if you ask a question in the Q&A, we'll just wait until she gets to that question period. And then I will read out those questions. And we might let you just turn on your mic. There's not that many of us, so that's easy to do. And speak about what the situation is or whatever it is you have a question about. This presentation is hosted by the Autism Support Network Society, or the ASN, and our vision is to create a secure, inclusive community of support, ensuring that families of those with autism have access to quality science-based treatment so that those with autism may reach their full potential. We are a charity run entirely by parents of children with autism. We rely on donations to pay for our education coordinator and executive director who make sure that we're providing quality science-based presentations and who are available to help parents, educate policymakers, and provide the latest information on treatments for behaviors associated with autism. We receive no funding from the government except gaming grants, so we can speak honestly about our experiences without having to toe the government line. We'll not be able to do a pub fundraiser this year thanks to the COVID-19 shutdown, and we appreciate any help you can give putting word out about the Autism Support Network charity. We are participating in the Scotiabank Charity Challenge for the 1 kilometer and 5 kilometer run, and we have several autism runners signed up on ASN Club Fit. So we're offering actually free registration for anybody with autism that would like to run, and or you can just support one of the runners that we have on there, and I'll send links in a follow-up email afterwards. If you haven't subscribed to our email list, I think I recognize most of the names here, so probably most of you are already on it. But in the follow-up email, I'll also put a link for subscribing. Actually, just throw into the chat right now if you are already on our email list, and then I won't even worry about it afterwards. We only send out information about our presentations and events that we feel are valuable for behavior intervention. Our goal is to not inundate you with too much information, but to help you focus on what is the most important thing for your child. And now I'll introduce our speaker. We have Elizabeth Goldstone. She's a board certified behavior analyst. She's been working in the field of applied behavior analysis since 2010. She became an associate at Semiamu Behavior Analysts Incorporated in 2016, where she continues to practice as an independent consultant. Elizabeth provides behavior analytic treatment for children and young adults with autism and developmental disabilities in home and school settings. She's committed to providing ethical, evidence-based treatment that prioritizes an individual approach to treatment, relationship building, and client safety. Her current practice focuses on comprehensive application of Dr. Greg Hanley's practical functional assessment. We just had a talk on that about that last week. And during the COVID pandemic, she designs a parent implementation model for the PFA that is applied via telehealth. So I'm just going to pass things over now. Elizabeth, feel free to add anything more. I did forget to mention she has a master's in science in, I think, applied behavior analysis. Is that right?
Yes,
okay, so thank you, Elizabeth, for putting together this talk. She's put together a 3-part series talk on to help us parents understand what applied behavior analysis is. We've got quite a few more attendees that have signed on. So if you want to just put on there whether or not you, where you're from, how old your child is, and whether or not you're already on our mailing list. And I'm just going to hand it over to Elizabeth now. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I am just going to share my PowerPoint here and hopefully it works well. There we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. I wish we could be together in person right now, but because of COVID, we have this lovely online webinar, which I think is still great. Normally, I would like to get to know you a little bit better, but I will give you some more information about me so that you know who you're talking to. So my name is Elizabeth Goldstone. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a board certified behavior analyst. I practice in Surrey, White Rock, and Langley in the Lower Mainland. And I'm currently providing most of my services via telehealth to keep everybody safe. I work with infants, toddlers, children, families, young adults, and school administrators in both home and school settings. My heart came to be with behavior analysis at the tender age of 9 years old when my younger sister was diagnosed with autism. And I am a plant lover and avid gardener. Fun fact about me. So today is part 1 of the Empowering Parents series, Foundational Skills for Participating in Your Home ABA Program. And today we are talking about understanding basic ABA principles and terminology for parents. So a few goals for this presentation today are to empower parents to participate in their child's home ABA program, to provide parents with the tools needed to assess their child's progress and evaluate the effectiveness of their child's ABA program, and to reduce barriers associated with parent education. So this presentation will cover principles and terminology from a variety of behavior analytic approaches, the school system, and different service providers. Please ask questions throughout the presentation. I will stop speaking quite frequently to cover your questions. So a few topics that we'll cover today in this presentation are parent participation, name that service provider, ABA and types of instruction, all about behavior, the ABCs of contingencies, consequences, motivating operations, skill acquisition, verbal behavior, prompting and tactics, maintenance and generalization, and some miscellaneous terms at the end. So in this presentation, I will primarily use the term parent to describe the adult caring for the person receiving ABA services, and I will primarily use the term child to describe the person receiving ABA services. The term parent can be substituted for caregiver, guardian, etc., and the term child is applicable to any learner, client, or student. So, parent participation. Parent involvement is one invariable factor and an integral part of success for early intervention programs for children with autism. This was said by Ozanoff and Cathcart in their 1998 article. I think that it's important for parents to be involved, though, in any ABA program, not just early intervention, of course. Parent involvement is shown to maximize a child's learning rate and skill development. Parent participation can support generalization of skills, which is use of the skills outside of the therapy session. And parent participation also allows parents to fully provide informed consent for their child's treatment program and any program changes that happen within that treatment program. So there is an ethics code that as behavior analysts, board certified behavior analysts or BCBAs, we must follow and strictly adhere to. And section 1.05B of our code says, when behavior analysts provide behavior analytics services, they use language that is fully understandable to the recipient of those services while remaining conceptually systematic within the profession of behavior analysis. We provide appropriate information prior to service delivery about the nature of our services and appropriate information later about results and conclusions. So we are required by our ethical code to use language that is understandable to parents so that they fully understand the treatment that they are receiving and that their child or dependent are receiving, so that they can provide informed consent for those treatments and services. On the left side of your screen, you will see a fancy little QR code. So if you pull up the camera on your phone, you don't have to take a picture of it. You can actually just hold up your camera. You will get a little drop-down link and you can click on it, and that will bring you to a very long PDF of our Code of Ethics. This presentation is also downloadable as a PDF, so you will also find the QR code there that you can scan later if you wish to reference our Code of Ethics. So the first thing I'm going to speak about is service providers and team members. And this was brought to my attention the other day by one of my awesome families who provided me with some feedback on what would be helpful for this talk. And the parent described this as alphabet soup, which I thought was a perfect way to explain all of the acronyms for the service providers that will be involved in your child's treatment. So service providers and team members, home teams often take a multidisciplinary approach to treatment, and there are a variety of service providers and other team members involved on the team. We often use acronyms for our professional designations and titles, a lot of acronyms. So all of the ones you see on your screen here are acronyms that we use all of the time. So let's start going through some of those acronyms for you. So BCBA is the first one. BCBA stands for Board Certified Behavior Analyst. So a BCBA has a master's degree in ABA, special education, or another related field. BCBAs have completed the requirements to write the board certification exam and have passed the exam. So the requirements to do that are 1,500 to 2,000 hours of experience that has been supervised by a BCBA. And we also have to pass a competency-based exam. We supervise home programs, and we are responsible for designing and monitoring clients' treatment. And we are bound by the BACB Ethics Code for Responsible Conduct. And BACB stands for the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. There are also BCABAs, which are Board Certified Assistant Behavior Analysts. And those people have bachelor's degrees in ABA, special education, or another related field. They've completed the requirements to pass the BCABA board certification exam. They work under the supervising BCBA to supervise home programs and provide support with designing and monitoring a child's treatment. And they can't work independently. They must be supervised by a BCBA, and they are also bound by the BACB Ethics Code for Responsible Conduct. Next, we have the terms BA or BC. So BC stands for Behavior Consultant, and BA stands for Behavior Analyst. These people might be a BCBA if they have completed an approved master's program or passed the board exam. There is no licensure in the province of BC, so anyone can use the title Behavior Consultant or Behavior Analyst. However, the only person that is allowed to use the term BCBA or Board Certified Behavior Analyst is someone who is board certified. They may or may not practice ABA, and they are not bound by the BACB Ethics Code if they are not a board certified behavior analyst or a BCBA. BI is a behavior interventionist. They may or may not have a degree in the field of psychology or experience working with children, adolescents, or adults who are or are not neurodiverse. They implement treatment plans or programs designed by a BCBA or BCABA, but they do not design or adjust intervention plans. They are trained by a BCBA to implement those plans, and they are trained on the client's individualized program. They are not bound by the BACB Ethics Code. However, on my teams, I provide behavior interventionists with a copy of the BACB Ethics Code, and encourage them to follow that ethics code because I think it's just good practice as a professional to be aware of the ethics code and the guidelines. Other service providers. So SLP is a speech language pathologist. Speech language pathologists develop communication skills, introduce communication tools, and help with oral motor skill development, among many other great things. They have a master's degree. They are registered with the College of Speech and Hearing Professionals of BC, and they may or may not have ABA or autism specific training. There's also an SLPA, which is a speech language assistant. SLPAs typically work under a registered SLP. They're similar to a BI from my understanding, and they may or may not have ABA or autism specific training. OT is an occupational therapist. They address motor, perceptual, sensory, and social challenges, among other things. OTs have a master's degree and they're registered with the College of Occupational Therapists of BC, and they may or may not have ABA or autism specific training. So for all of the professionals that I've included on here, I have gathered some information from the RASP list descriptions, and the link is down there below. There's also PT, which is a physical therapist. Physical therapists can help children understand how and why movement and function take place, assist with managing physical conditions, limitations, or restrictions. They typically have a bachelor's degree. They are registered with the College of Physical Therapists of BC, and they may or may not have ABA or autism specific training. So a few common school team members that you might come across are an IST or integration support teacher. In districts other than Surrey, this person could be called a resource teacher, a student support teacher, or a skill development teacher. These people are certified teachers, and they are often the case manager for students in elementary and high school. An EA is an education assistant. EAs have an EA certificate with at least one practicum included, and they provide direct support to designated students in schools. An ABA support worker or an ABA-SW is something specific to the Surrey School District. These people have 1,000 hours of ABA experience when they enter the school district, and they were required to complete Surrey College ABA coursework. And they provide direct support to a student with an ABA designation in the Surrey School District. So this is something unique to the Surrey School District, where if a BCBA is supervising a child's home program, you can apply for a designation within the school district to get an ABA trained support worker. All right, our first question break. Does anybody have any questions so far about any of those things?
I'm just going to comment. One is that also, I believe on our website, we have under the ABA, there's a section on consultants, and we have a link to as well the BACB site where the ethics are. So it's also on there. And oh yeah, and also some districts have ABA EAs. So if you're interested in that in your school, you want an EA that has some ABA experience, ask if the district is hiring anybody with ABA experience in particular, that if they have a separate coding for that, for their EAs. And if they don't, you can also try to demand that. So it's the school districts where parents have been active, that's where they're hiring EAs that have ABA experience, or they call them ABA EAs. The critical thing about EAs is that they have a training from a college called CETA, Special Education Teaching Assistant. And the difference is that in Surrey, the ABA support workers don't require that qualification. They just need their 1,000 hours of ABA experience. They do have to take an ABA qualification course in that district. But some other districts are hiring people without those qualifications, and they're still allowing them to be EAs. I don't see any other questions yet. Are we everybody okay? We good to move on? Okay.
All right, we'll keep going. All right, so ABA. What is applied behavior analysis, or ABA? Well, it is the science devoted to the understanding and improvement of human behavior. And this was said by Cooper, Heron, and Hayward. So with ABA, we seek to improve the overall wellness of the client, and that includes the child receiving treatment or the adolescent receiving treatment and family members. ABA should prioritize an individualized approach to treatment. It's ethical, it encourages relationship building and client safety throughout assessment and treatment. All right, so service models. ABA is the foundation that BCBAs use to teach new skills. We use the principles of ABA and research findings to determine how to teach new skills. The philosophies and training of BCBAs varies depending on where they completed their degree, their internship, supervision, and their own beliefs or philosophies about how services should be delivered. While we are required to follow the BACB Code of Ethics, we do have some freedom in choosing how we practice. While BCBAs use ABA as a foundation to teach new skills, we may also integrate other approaches into treatment, like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, the Early Start Denver model, or ESDM, and other developmental approaches, among other things. Before integrating other approaches into their treatment, BCBAs must be competent in these approaches. BCBAs may use parent-led approaches or a collaborative approach to treatment. So when I talk about parent-led approaches, that may mean that the BCBA primarily works on the goals that the parent says that are important to them, which we all always do, but that may be something that they focus on is just the goals that the parents say that they would like to achieve with their child. Or they may use a collaborative approach to treatment where the parent discusses some of the goals that they have for their child, and the BCBA also discusses some of their recommendations for goals based on an assessment or observations. BCBAs may have a wide scope of practice and provide services to individuals of all ages with a variety of developmental disabilities, or they may specialize in one or two areas of practice, like early intervention or parent-implemented interventions, for example. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the different types of instruction that you may see when you receive ABA services. Again, the types of instruction that are used in your ABA services may vary depending on your BCBA's scope of practice and their philosophies about teaching. So the three primary types of instruction are natural environment teaching, also called NET, incidental teaching, and discrete trial teaching, or DTT. So natural environment teaching, we'll start with that one, that's NET. NET is loosely structured sessions. It's where we teach in the context of play or everyday events. We use a variety of materials. We incorporate naturalistic reinforcers, and it's often initiated by a child's interest. So the best way to imagine this is sitting down on the floor with a child with a bunch of toys and activities that they enjoy and just playing. And when natural opportunities arise for teachable moments for the student to request things or label things or initiate play or be imaginative or flexible, those are things that the instructor would then take advantage of those moments and use those as teachable moments. There's also incidental teaching, which in some of the literature that I was reviewing is something that can be used interchangeably with natural environment teaching. The term could mean the same thing. However, in my practice, incidental teaching is opportunities to teach in the moment. We use it to maintain and generalize skills across environments or people. And it's incorporated throughout the session during natural environment teaching time and discrete trial teaching time. So I use this in my practice for when a child needs help with something, if it's during one of their programs or if it's during a playtime, we would teach the child to request for help. So that is taking advantage of a situation in the moment and teaching in that natural moment. There's also discrete trial teaching, and this is a more structured type of activity for a student to work on. So the sessions are more structured. You teach in a work context, so often at the table or on a specific place on the floor where it's distraction free. You typically use specific materials like particular toys or flashcards. We often have a single acceptable response, and we often use contrived reinforcement. So an example of this would be perhaps teaching a child to color inside the lines of a coloring sheet. So we would have them sit at their little desk or their little table, or if they prefer to sit on the floor, we would sit on the floor and put their coloring sheet on a clipboard. And we would use specific crayons that are the right fit for the student given their fine motor skills. And the single acceptable response would be staying within so many centimeters of the line. And our contrived reinforcement might be a token for that student. So giving them one of their Velcro tokens on their token board is what we might use for discrete trial teaching. So in our practice, we're not confined to using just one of these different types of instruction. We can use all of them. And in my practice, I use all of them, but not with every student. I don't only use discrete trial teaching ever. I always have a mixture, but that mixture and the percentage of what I use of each type of instruction really varies based on the student's goals. So here are just some examples of what we could teach using each of these types of instruction. So in natural environment teaching, we can teach imaginary play, initiating play, attending to peer initiations, which in this case, it might be the BI initiating play, saying like, hey, Zachary, look at my red car, it's so fast. And Zachary's looking at the BI, or responding to peers. So the BI might say, hey, do you like this castle that I built? It is so tall. And we may want the student to respond like, cool, or give a thumbs up. In incidental teaching, some examples are requesting help, like the example I gave on the previous slide, waiting as well. So maybe we're teaching the child to wait so that when they're in school, they can tolerate waiting during transition times in class because there's a lot of waiting in school. So maybe we tell that BI, make sure you take a little bit of extra time when you're transitioning between programs to get the materials out so that the child can practice waiting during a natural opportunity. And accepting no might be another one that we teach incidentally. So sometimes a student can have a snack right in the middle of their session, and sometimes they need to wait 5 minutes until they're finished the activity that they're working on. And in discrete trial teaching, we might use that to teach matching. So matching 3 objects that are the same, or maybe non-identical 3D objects, so 2 objects that are different, like 2 spoons, for example. Labeling things, so labeling pictures on flashcards, or even imitation, where we're sitting down with a student and we're teaching them how to imitate us. So we might say, do this and clap our hands, and then the student would then clap their hands. We would teach imitation in a structured way. So almost all of the skills above can be taught using multiple types of instruction. And again, this is something that would be individualized based on the student's goals and the prerequisite skills that they already have. All right. Any questions about those things or comments?
There does not appear to be any.
Okay. I will continue then.
Okay. No questions, anybody?
And if there are any terms that I use during this presentation that you'd like me to define for you, please let me know. I do much better with that coming up where I have lots of definitions, but I do realize that I've thrown out a few terms already that you may not know the meaning of. So please just ask so that I can clarify
And
as
feel
well.
free to ask about why we do things like matching, or um, our children are quite different, and they sort of have to be taught things more literally than the neurotypical children. They'll just pick things up more naturally, but our children need some of these things to practice. Oh, say we have a
Yes,
question.
exactly.
Can parents choose about the teaching types?
That's a great question. Yes, you can. And I think that's something that's important to ask when you're interviewing behavior consultants when you're starting to look for one, is asking them what type of teaching tactics or strategies they use in their practice. Some behavior analysts use play to teach all of the skills in their program, and some use a mixture like me, and some people use a lot more discrete trial training, or there's some other approaches out there as well that I haven't included in my presentation because I'm not competent with them. And I don't also think that I'm competent to speak about them, but there's lots of different types of instruction out there. So I think that asking those questions during the interview process is important if there's one type of instruction that you prefer.
Although, as a new parent coming to this with no idea whatsoever what ABA should look like or does or anything like that, it can sometimes be easy to want things to be, I can't say nice looking, but you want the child to have as natural experience as possible. And that happens as much as they can. But on the other hand, they need to learn things differently than our regular kids do. And so when you're doing discrete trial, for example, it allows an ability to learn a lot of things in a short period of time. And then later on in life, they're using the terms that they used out in the natural environment while we're out having a walk or doing whatever. But having those opportunities that are quick and fast, and that even uses flashcards. And that's not the entire program, but some of the program, it just allows that child to learn things a lot faster and more systematically, I think. Would you say, Elizabeth? Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly. And it also gives us an opportunity to practice a lot within a short period of time, which maximizes learning a lot of the time.
Mhm.
So if we can do 10 imitation trials or 10 times of teaching a child to imitate in 2 minutes, they're going to pick up that skill a lot quicker than if we're doing 2 or 3 times in 2 hours of play, for example. So
And
there is a time for some of those mass teaching opportunities.
And imitation is really important because everybody learns a lot by watching the people around them. Our children are not doing that naturally. They do not watch someone and then imitate their behavior. Our neurotypical children will watch our parents talking on the phone and they'll talk on the phone that way, or they'll watch them, anything that they do, open an umbrella, whatever. Whereas with the children with autism, if we can teach them to pay attention to those things and imitate, first of all, one thing and then maybe two things in a row, then they're able to learn from other people more easily. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that the BCBAs will set up for the child to learn that the parent may not think is important, but in fact, it's a building block for huge things coming down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions? Good. Okay. All right. Let's carry on.
All right. Okay, so next we are going to talk about behavior. So behavior. I will reference the term behavior a lot during this presentation. In this presentation, behavior refers to things that we do. It could be positive things or negative things. So behavior is anything that we do. So a behavior for me right now is drinking from my water bottle because my mouth is dry. That's a behavior. It's not a negative thing. It's just something that I'm doing. It's positive. Actually, I'm keeping myself hydrated. All right. So one of the terms we'll talk about now is target behavior. And this is the behavior targeted for change. So this could be a negative behavior like spitting, for example, or it could be a skill we want to teach, like tying shoes. That could be the target behavior, is tying shoes. All right. So some other examples here are increasing the accuracy of printing letters. So teaching a student how to print letters accurately, or decreasing bolting into the street. So those are examples of target behaviors. So there are a few different ways that we describe behavior. In terms of behavior we may want to reduce, or behavior we may want to replace, or new behaviors that we want to teach, like skills. So one of the ways that we can describe behavior is by its topography. So that's what behavior looks like. So we may describe behavior like hitting as hitting with an open hand. That's what the behavior looks like. Or using a pincer grasp to place a block onto the tower. So pincer grasp is like this. So that's what the behavior looks like. We may also describe behavior by its frequency. So that's how often a behavior occurs. So for example, a behavior may occur 10 times in an intervention session. That's its frequency. We may also describe behavior by its duration. So that's how long the behavior occurs for. So she laughed for 3 minutes. Laughing is a behavior, and it occurred for 3 minutes. That's the duration. We can also talk about the rate of behavior. So the rate is the number of events of the behavior in a particular period of time. So for example, maybe the child burped 10 times in 5 minutes. That is the rate. So it's the number of events over some period of time. The magnitude of the behavior. So the size of the behavior, like a touch or a punch. Those are two different magnitudes of behavior. And then latency. Latency is the length of time between the instruction and the behavior. So when a student requests help, there might be a latency of 10 seconds before he says, "Help, please," and I present him with a prompt to ask for help. So that might also be, for some children do take some time to respond. So that might be where we say, "What's your name?" And it takes 5 seconds for the student to say, "Jimmy." That's the latency, 5 seconds between me saying, "What's your name?" and the student saying, "Jimmy." All right, this is a quick section here, but I know I just threw out a whole bunch of terms, so I'm actually going to see if I can go back to them here. Does anybody have any questions about these terms at all?
I don't see any. I know that many of the people on here have actually just attended one of my workshops, so that might help they're on with what the behavior is, because a lot of people tend to think
Great.
behavior just means a negative behavior, right? That we're fixing a
Yeah.
negative behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Sometimes we're trying to increase a positive behavior as well.
Mhm.
Okay,
All right, I'll keep going.
there you go.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about contingencies, and this is how behaviors work. So again, behaviors, things that we want to decrease, or maybe skills we want to teach as well. So here's a term for you: contingent. Contingent means dependent on something else, and it's a relationship between two events. So for example, we deliver praise contingent on a correct response. Translation of that, we say, Awesome work when he colors in the lines. Okay. So we're delivering praise. Awesome work. Contingent on him coloring inside the lines. So when he colors inside the lines. So contingent is a word that behavior analysts use a lot in our practice. So there's something called the three-term contingency, and this is what we use to teach new skills, but it's also how we analyze challenging behaviors that are happening. So the three-term contingency is the ABCs. So the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. ABC. So the antecedent is an event that occurs before the behavior. Examples of antecedents are instructions. So the BI may say, what is this? It could be a demand, like, give me the iPad, or it could even be a loud sound, like the sound of a fire alarm. The behavior is what a person does. It's observable. So some examples are responding to the question. The student could say, a dog. That's the behavior. A student could follow the demand, so giving mom the iPad, that's a behavior. And responding to the sound of the fire alarm, running away, that's the behavior. It's observable. And then the consequence. The consequence occurs in the environment immediately after the behavior. And we'll talk more about consequences in a few minutes. But just briefly, some examples of consequences are praise. Yeah, you got it. That's a dog. Social attention. Mom gives a high five for the student relinquishing the iPad. Or maybe support is provided after the student runs away because of the sound of the fire alarm. The EA follows the student and gives him some noise canceling headphones. That's a consequence. We use the three-term contingency to analyze an environmental event that leads up to a behavior. So determining why a behavior might be occurring, analyzing the consequence that might be maintaining a behavior. Again, maintaining a behavior that's either a skill or an adaptive behavior, or a negative behavior or a challenging behavior. And then teaching new skills in a systematic means structured way. So here's an example of the three-term contingency in use. The antecedent is the fire alarm sounds. The behavior is the student bolts out of the hallway doors. And the consequence is that the EA runs after the student and gives him noise canceling headphones. Another example, an application in discrete trial teaching. The antecedent, the BI says, what is it? The student says, a dog. And the BI says, yeah, you're right, it's a dog. So that's the antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So this is another application of the three-term contingency. All right, so I also wanted to mention, because we all practice a little bit differently as BCBAs, some people will use the term antecedent, and some people will use the term discriminative stimulus. Try saying that 10 times fast. It's tricky. We also call that the SD. So if you're looking through your child's program binder or some notes from your BCBA, you may see the term antecedent being used, or you may see the term SD being used. They all mean the same thing. SD, same thing as antecedent. It's an instruction or a cue. All right, any questions about the three-term contingency?
Would you say that in everyday life, a neurotypical child experiences this ABC, and even you or I do? So this isn't something unnatural or anything. This is really what motivates us to do things or what helps us learn things.
It does, totally. Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, here's an example right now. Antecedent, I'm talking a lot. Behavior, I'm drinking water. Consequence, my mouth isn't so dry anymore, so I can talk more. So we can break down everything that we do into antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. You can analyze your spouse's behavior using ABCs for something fun to do as well. I mean, it's really cool. It's widely applicable to human behavior.
And some people use ABA to, for example, help them to stop smoking, which is a behavior, to help them change that behavior by providing a reinforcement for perhaps an alternative behavior, something like that. So ABA can be used to change behaviors at all. We do have a question here. Let me just see if I can get a hold of her. Okay, so I'm going to allow Erin to talk. I think she has a question.
Great.
Erin, I allowed you to talk, I think, but I think you might have to turn on your mic. I don't see if I can.
Sorry, that was a mistake. I clicked a button by mistake.
Oh, okay. So you weren't raising your hand. Okay, so everything's good?
Yes,
Okay.
everything's good. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll turn you back off then.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Go. Okay. All right.
All right.
Move along.
We'll continue.
Okay.
And of course, if you think of any questions from previous sections as we go, just throw them into the chat box or the question center, and we'll get to them when the next question slide shows up. All right, let's talk about consequences. So the term consequence occurs in the environment immediately after the behavior. Consequences include reinforcement and punishment. So consequences are not only punishment or bad things. So let's talk about reinforcement, because I'd like to focus our conversation on that today. So with reinforcement, it occurs when a stimulus change immediately follows a response and increases the future frequency of that type of behavior in the future. This is from Cooper, which is an ABA textbook. I'm just going to move my video here so that I can see my slide properly. There we go. So translation of Cooper's definition of reinforcement. Reinforcement is a change in the environment that occurs immediately following a behavior that increases the behavior in the future. So reinforcement happens after a behavior. All right, there we go. So positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is something, a stimulus, is presented right after a behavior, and it increases that behavior in the future. So think of positive as something being presented. They both start with the letter P. This is how I remembered it when I was in my undergrad years. So examples of positive reinforcement, things being presented, praise, so saying things like good job or nice work, feedback, yeah, that's how you print your name. Something tangible, like presentation of a toy or a highly preferred item, that is known as a reinforcer. Or it could be an edible reinforcer, like a little piece of chip or a sip of pop or something like that. So that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when something, a stimulus, is removed immediately following a behavior, and that increases the behavior in the future. Negative means removed. Now, negative reinforcement is not punishment. It is also something good. So, for example, a break from instruction is an example of negative reinforcement. A demand is being removed. That's a break from instruction. That's negative reinforcement. Removal of a non-preferred activity or task is another example of negative reinforcement. So here are some more examples side by side for you. Positive reinforcement, some examples. thanking your partner for putting their dirty laundry in the basket. So you're presenting praise. Getting your child an ice cream cone for having a good report card. You're presenting an ice cream cone. Receiving a bonus at work for your productivity. You're receiving a bonus. You're being presented with a bonus. Positive reinforcement. Some examples of negative reinforcement: applying sunscreen before sun tanning. You're avoiding sunburn. So that's going to be your negative reinforcer. You're avoiding a sunburn. Taking off your jacket when you get hot. You're cooling yourself down. Cooling yourself down is a negative reinforcer. Or leaving the house early before work so that you're not late. You're avoiding being late. That's a negative reinforcer. The effect on behavior is the same. Behavior increases in the future for both positive and negative reinforcement. There are different schedules of reinforcement. This is a very complex kind of principle within applied behavior analysis, and it really varies from home team to home team. So I'll just provide you with a very basic overview of this. So there are two different schedules of reinforcement broadly. There's continuous reinforcement and intermittent reinforcement. So with continuous reinforcement, every occurrence of the target behavior is reinforced. And we do this when we're establishing new behaviors. Intermittent reinforcement is when some, but not all occurrences of the target behavior are reinforced. And we use this when we're maintaining the skills that we've already developed. So some examples here to connect it. Continuous reinforcement. Examples: a token is provided for every correct response. A BI provides praise for every correct response. A parent gives a child a cookie for every correct response every time they ask for a cookie. Intermittent reinforcement. A token is given for every third correct response. The BI provides praise for every fourth response. When a child screams candy, sometimes the parent gives the child candy. So just sometimes, it's intermittent. So in ABA, we use continuous reinforcement when we are trying to establish new behaviors or new skills. And for early learners, we often use continuous reinforcement all of the time until we have built up some skills. Now, in real life, outside of an ABA therapy session, you don't get praise for every correct response or for every positive behavior that you do. You get intermittent reinforcement, and often in real life, we get reinforcement very little, very intermittently. So it's important as the home program progresses that we move from continuous reinforcement to more intermittent reinforcement so that those behaviors that we've taught can withstand the test of time and withstand being in a natural environment like a school or a park or a grocery store. So we need to do some of that work of slowly shifting the reinforcement from being all of the time to some of the time in the home program, and continue to make that shift when we introduce those other environments like schools, playgrounds, community centers, shopping malls, wherever it is. We need to continue that work of lessening the access to reinforcement so that behaviors continue, those skills continue in those environments with less reinforcement. All right. So next I'm going to talk about motivating operations. This is a rather long section, so if you have questions, please pop them into the chat box. I have it on my second screen. I'm going to watch it closely. So if you have questions throughout this, please do ask. And if something comes up, please just interrupt me and I will stop and answer your question, because this is an important section, but it's a lot. So motivating operations, or MOs. Motivating operations mean motivation, in short. So that's the value or the effectiveness of a reinforcer. And the effect on behavior is an increase or a decrease. Now, this seems like a lot right now, but I'm going to break it down for you in the next slides. So motivating operations can affect all of the different descriptions of behavior we talked about earlier. So motivating operations can affect what behavior looks like. They can affect the frequency, how often a behavior happens, can affect the duration, and all of those other things. So here's some examples for you, and these aren't written on here. So duration. If a child is very motivated to access their iPad, but it's bedtime. If they are so motivated to access their iPad, but it's bedtime, the duration of their protest, or their crying, or their yelling, or their asking for the iPad will be much longer if their motivation is high to access that. All right, so it can affect the duration of that. The other thing that MOs can affect is frequency. So how often a behavior is occurring. If you're giving your child a Skittle every time they maybe urinate in the potty, they're going to be really motivated to go in the potty a lot of the time. You're going to increase the frequency when their motivation is high to get that Skittle. So those are just some examples of how MOs can affect behavior. So one type of motivating operation is called an establishing operation. So with an establishing operation, it increases the value or the effectiveness of the reinforcer. So it increases the value of the preferred thing for the child, or the effectiveness of that thing. It also increases the frequency of the behavior. So for an example, putting the child's iPad on the counter acts as an establishing operation for the child to ask to play on the iPad. So putting the iPad out of reach increases the value of the reinforcer, or the effectiveness of it, the reinforcer, the iPad, and it increases the frequency of the behavior, which is asking to play on the iPad. If the iPad's out of reach, you're going to increase how often the child is asking for the iPad, because they need to ask for it, and they're going to want the iPad. So this increases the value of the reinforcer, because the reinforcer, the iPad, it's not freely available in the environment. It's out of reach. It also increases the frequency of requesting or communicating, also called manding, which I'll go over later. So asking for things. So we're setting up an establishing operation. We're setting up motivation to communicate. So with motivating operations, specifically establishing operations, deprivation can increase the effectiveness or value of the reinforcer. Translation: an item that is not freely available or is not available often will be more valuable to the person and be more effective as a reinforcer. Or it will just be a reinforcer. We'll talk more about that coming up though. All right, the opposite of establishing operation is abolishing operation. It sounds bad, and it is, because it means that we're not motivated. It decreases the value or effectiveness of the reinforcer, and it decreases the frequency of the behavior. Putting the child's iPad on the floor acts as an abolishing operation for the child to ask to play on the iPad. It decreases the value of the iPad because it's freely available, so the child can have it for free whenever they want. So it's not valuable to them. It also decreases the frequency of requesting or communicating, also called manding, for the iPad, because the child doesn't have to ask for it. because it's freely available in the environment. So some important points. MOs can change frequently in terms of the value and effectiveness of the reinforcer. Satiation and deprivation can affect the value of the reinforcer. So satiation is when we have too much of something. That makes things less valuable to us. So if a child has access to their iPad before their session, in the session, the iPad's not going to be valuable to them or function as a reinforcer because they just had lots of free access to it. So they're satiated on it. So we want there to be some deprivation in effect to increase the value of something that we want to be a reinforcer. So if you want your reinforcer to be an iPad, maybe it has to be put away for a few hours before the session. Or if you want a reinforcer to be the bag of sensory toys, you're going to want to have those put away maybe for even a few days before the session to make sure that the student is motivated to access them. MOs can change based on our biological needs. So for example, Sammy doesn't drink much water at school, so he's motivated to access a mini can of Pepsi when he finishes his schoolwork. However, if he's been drinking water all day at school, or he's got free access to juice boxes at home, he's probably not going to be motivated to access a mini can of Pepsi. So as behavior analysts, we may ask you sometimes to put certain things away within a certain period of time before a session, or restrict access to certain things like treats or particular toys, or maybe even certain apps on the iPad, so that the student's motivated to access those things during their sessions. Other important points for motivating operations. Our preferences change over time as we develop. Preferences for a different item altogether can develop. So I used to enjoy watching Judge Judy, but now that I'm older, I like watching Friends. Or Joey used to love playing with trains, and now he's in kindergarten. He's only into Pokemon. So our preferences can change for items altogether. So we need to make sure that we know what that person's really motivated for. Preference for a specific type of item. I prefer Starbucks Nespresso pods over Tim Hortons Nespresso pods. My MO for making coffee at home changes depending on which pods are available. If Tim Hortons is available at home, I'm driving to Starbucks. My MO is not high for making coffee at home. My reinforcer is not going to be effective, and Tim Hortons is of no value to me. I love Starbucks. Another example, Jacob loves McDonald's fries and he will only eat McDonald's fries. He is not motivated to eat his sandwich if there are no name brand fries available after he's done that sandwich. So what is a reinforcer today may not be a reinforcer tomorrow, or maybe it won't be a reinforcer 5 minutes from now. Everyone's satiation point is very different. For me, if I have one chocolate, I'm satiated on chocolate, I'm done. My husband can eat a whole box of chocolates and he could probably still keep eating them after that. His satiation point is very different. And that's for every other item that's valuable to us or motivated to access, or that's a reinforcer. Every item can have a different satiation point for a person too. So these are all things we need to consider when we're running a home program, or even when we're trying to work with our child at home outside of that home program. We want to make sure they're motivated to access things, because that's how we teach them to communicate with us, to tell us what they want so that they can access those things and to do work with us. Other important points, evaluate your reinforcers often. So find out what the person is motivated for. Conduct a preference assessment to determine what is motivating for the student. A preference assessment it can be a formal procedure, but it can also be an informal procedure. And it's what we use to determine what the child is motivated to access. So usually what we'll do is we'll place several preferred items in front of the student and see what they go for. We provide brief access to the item that they grab, And then we continue on with our work tasks and provide that item as the reinforcer. And then maybe after they have access to that item, they drop it on the floor and they don't want it anymore. So we need to present more items again to see what they're motivated to access. Things that we have free access to all of the time are typically not our reinforcers. So how to identify reinforcers? Here are some more things. So there is no universal reinforcer. My reinforcer is coffee and buying more plants. That is not the same as your child's reinforcers or your reinforcers. So there's no universal reinforcer. Everybody has a different reinforcer. All reinforcers have a satiation point, which I talked about a little bit previously. Variety is the spice of life. Offer choices. The more reinforcers that we can offer, the better. We will have more valuable reinforcers and our reinforcers will be more effective. You can ask the person what they like. You can present choices vocally. Hey, I'm going to the store. Do you want me to buy you chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry ice cream? Or, hey, you know, what kind of fruit do you want to have today for your snack? Give the person a choice. Ask the person what they want. Use a preference assessment. So put out a bunch of items and see what the person goes for. For a student who is using an AAC device, we can set up a board and put a bunch of choices on there as well and ask them, what do you want? Try something. Reinforcer sampling. It's like Costco, but at home. But there's no Costco samples anymore because of COVID. Reinforcer sampling. Put a chip on the table and see if the child eats it. Do they look like they enjoyed that chip? Or did they have a grossed out look on their face and they didn't like that salt and vinegar chip? Sample things. Start up one of those free apps from the App Store. See if the child engages with it. If they engage with it for 30 seconds, it's probably going to be something they like. Reinforcers may change depending on the setting. What's available in that setting might not compete. So if you have a TV on in the other room and your child's having therapy, can hear the TV, they might be coming into that room to see the TV instead of working for their iPad. The iPad and the TV might be competing. The child's coming to see the TV, that's probably their reinforcer right now. Or just what's available in the environment. So not all of our reinforcers are always going to be available. If we're in the car on a road trip, you're not going to have all of the reinforcers from your home available. So what's available? What can be that reinforcer? One final important consideration: the magnitude of the response versus the magnitude of the consequence. The translation of this: the effort required to do the response of the behavior versus the quality or quantity of the reinforcer. Is it worth it? Are you motivated to do that response or that behavior, given the reinforcer that's available to you? If you tell your child, I want you to go make all of the beds in the house, and after you make all of the beds, I am going to give you one M&M. Magnitude of the response is not equal to magnitude of the consequence. Your child's not going to want one M&M for making all the beds in the house. He's going to want like an hour of computer time or video game time. So you need to offer a consequence that matches the response effort required to do the behavior, do the skill. All right, that was a big section. I can't actually see the question box on my
There
screen,
isn't
so I'm not sure
any questions and no more comments
Okay.
that I can see. do want to say this is big, and I found that when I was starting off in ABA with my son, I attended things like this several times until when someone would mention these things, I knew what they were talking about. So we will have a recording of this so people can actually watch it again and again. Plus we'll have the slides, and rather than attending other presentations, you can just go and watch this again. So that will be available. And yeah, we've had a couple people that wrote to me, they had to leave, but I told them we'll also have the recording, and it will take me a couple days to get the recording out.
Great.
No questions so far.
All right. I'll continue then. If anybody has questions that you think of, just type them in there and I will answer them.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's move on now to talk a bit about skill acquisition. So the translation of skill acquisition repertoires are organizing the skills we are teaching into categories. Some of the categories we use are academics, communication, expanded community of reinforcers, and self-management. There may be other categories that consultants will organize skills into, but these ones are probably the most common. So academics, examples, literacy skills, numeracy, fine motor. Fine motor is things like cutting, writing, painting, drawing. Or for some of my kiddos who are going into kindergarten, fine motor is opening a container from their lunch and maybe even closing their container as well. Communication, labeling objects, requesting things, greetings, following 1 to 5-step instructions. Expanded community of reinforcers, things like independent play, cooperative play, imaginary play, and leisure skills. So expanded community of reinforcers are things that we enjoy doing and things that we can enjoy doing independently as well. Self-management, things like toileting, hand washing, relaxation or calming procedures, reducing dangerous behaviors as well. So other things that are included in skill acquisition, expressive skills, so using words or actions to communicate a response, vocally or non-vocally. So using an AAC device or an iPad or Proloquo or touch chat to request help, or vocally saying fish when a BI says gives the student a plush fish toy. There's also receptive or listener responding. That's understanding language. An example, the BI says, give me the horse toy, and the student gives the BI a horse toy. A parent says, go get your shoes, and the child goes and gets his shoes. Other items from skill acquisition, fine motor. So fine motor is small muscle movements. We often refer to fine motor when we talk about a child's hands. So grasping objects or object manipulation. So putting pieces in a puzzle or putting shapes in a shape sorter or building a Lego structure. Gross motor skills, those are large muscle movements. Things like crawling, walking, running, or climbing. All right, so that section was very brief, and I see that we have a question here. So I'm going to address the question. Thank you for asking that. So the question is, can timeout be considered negative reinforcement? That is a very good question. So it could, depending on its effect on behavior. So if a child, let's say, spits, for example, and you put the child in timeout, and we see that the behavior of spitting increases when we give timeout, then it could actually function as negative reinforcement because we're seeing an increase in behavior. Now, If timeout reduces behavior, so if a child spits, they have a timeout, and we see spitting decrease, timeout actually functions as a punishment. So timeout is a punishment procedure, but timeout doesn't always function as punishment unless we actually see a reduction in the behavior. So if we saw an increase in the behavior after a timeout, so spitting, let's say spitting increased after we started giving timeouts, then that means that the student may be trying to avoid something in their environment. So they spit and they know that they can escape that thing in the environment by spitting and getting a timeout. Does that help answer the question? All right, I'm going to continue, and I can definitely comment back on that as well if you have further questions or comments about that. All right, so I'm going to continue on here with verbal behavior. So this is another group of terms that are often used in home ABA programs. And they're used a lot by behavior analysts as we speak. We love to use verbal behavior terms. So there are 4 different kinds of verbal behavior. There are mands, tacts, intraverbals, and echoics. So I'm going to go into each one of these in detail. Verbal behavior, a mand. Mands are known as demands, so demand. It's a request for a reinforcer, an object, an activity, or information. And mands are maintained by obtaining the requested item. So here's an example. A child wants to watch Dora. So the child says, Dora! The parent turns on a Dora show. So the child saying Dora is a mand. It's a demand, it's a request. Other examples of mands are, can I have more juice, please? That's a demand. What time is it? Demand. Help me, please. That's a mand. I want more juice. Water. Or maybe for some students, it's saying wawa. Or maybe for some students, it's pressing a button or a symbol on their AAC device to request something like help or marshmallows. So just because we're saying verbal behavior as well, I do want to clarify this. These terms are called verbal behavior, but you can communicate verbal behavior non-vocally. All right. So I like to talk about vocal responses and non-vocal responses. So vocal would be responses that I'm making right now by speaking with my vocal cords, and non-vocal would be using an AAC device or pictures or writing things. So verbal behavior can also be non-vocally produced as well. So verbal behavior tacts are labels or comments. And an example of this is that a child sees a picture of Dora. They say Dora, and the parent says, yeah, it's Dora. So it's just labeling things. So other examples, there's a cat on the fence. That's labeling. This box is heavy. That's a comment. Something smells good. That's another tact. Child sees a dog and points to the dog and says, dog. That's another tact. Elizabeth sees a big apple in the tree and says, big apple. That's another tact. So with mans, tacs, intraverbals, echoics, there's no requirement for how many words it is to be classified as verbal behavior. It doesn't even have to be a word. Like wawa could mean water, and that's verbal behavior. Verbal behavior, intraverbal responses. So intraverbal responses are responses to another person's verbal behavior, like a conversation. Greetings, talking about future or completed events, or fill in the blanks. So an example, if a BI says, "What's your favorite TV show?" The child says, "Dora." The BI says, "I like that too." The child saying Dora is an intraverbal response. They're answering the BI's question. So the answer is what we call an intraverbal response. So with verbal behavior, intraverbal responses, some other examples are, if I say twinkle, twinkle, and Betty says little star is an intraverbal response. They've filled in the blanks. Responding good after asking someone, "How are you?" So responding to a question, that's another example of an intraverbal response. An example of this in my programming is that I may have a program for a student called Animals General Knowledge, intraverbal response, where I hold up a picture of an animal and I say, "It's a," and the child needs to say cat. Cat is an intraverbal response. I may also have a program in called actions, intraverbal response. And that's where I say, "What's happening?" and show the child an actions card. And they say, "Fishing." Fishing is an intraverbal response. They answered my question. So those are some examples of intraverbal responses in a home program. Echoics. Echoics are repeating exactly what is heard or imitating. It has point-to-point correspondence, translation. What is heard and what is said are the same. So if a BI says Dora, the child says Dora, the BI says Dora. This is also an example of your three-term contingency here. The antecedent is the BI saying Dora, the behavior, the child says Dora, and then the BI says Dora in an excited voice tone. That's your consequence. Another example there. So an echoic here is the BI says Dora and the child says Dora right after. The child imitates the BI's response. Other examples. BI says help, child says help. Mom says goldfish crackers, child says goldfish crackers. A non-example would be when mom says, "Say please," the child says, "Please." That's not an example of an echoic because the mom said, "Say please," and the child only said, "Please." That is not an echoic response. Okay, questions? I don't see any other questions in here. Nancy, do we have any questions in the question box?
Nope. I'm sorry for disappearing earlier. I had a little emergency. I just wanted to say with regards to the timeout, and I was trying to listen to see if you were mentioning this or not, so please pardon me asking if you did. If the timeout, what would be the reason that the timeout would actually increase the spitting? Did you talk about that?
I did briefly, but I'll talk about it again because I think that there's a lot to talk about with that question. So if spitting increased after timeout was implemented, it may be because the person is spitting to avoid something in their environment, like a demand or a task, and they know that they won't have to do that demand or task if they spit and get removed from that environment to have a timeout. Or maybe they're accessing something really preferred during that timeout, like their TV in their room or something. That's often kids will do. They'll turn the TV on in the room. It's kind of sneaky. So then it actually turns into being a reinforcer for them. They know that they're going to get something good out of it, either escaping the demand or maybe getting extra TV time if they spit, so they'll spit more often.
Good. And will you talk a little bit about the function of behavior? Is that something that might come in a future talk? Because it was why did the child do the behavior was sort of what you find out when a reinforcement isn't working or when something you're doing isn't working.
Totally, yeah. I'm going to include some information about functions of behavior in my next talk when we go into some more about data analysis. So we'll start to analyze antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So I'll include a bit about functions of behavior in there as well.
Good. And I think looking at data collection and stuff is very important. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
All right, I think I'll continue.
Okay.
All right. So prompting and tactics is what I'm going to talk about next. So prompts and tactics are added to an instruction, or they are presented following an instruction to support the learner in practicing a response. Prompts are faded as the student learns the skill and develops, more independence with demonstrating the skill. Translation: for fading means reducing or removing slowly. So when we say prompts are faded, it means we're slowly removing prompts. So there are lots of different kinds of prompts. There are hand-over-hand prompts or full physical prompts where we will guide a student to do the exact behavior. There are partial physical prompts, which is where we are usually trying to decrease a hand-over-hand prompt. So we might start out with a hand-over-hand prompt to print something like you see in the picture there, and then maybe we'll move on to helping the student print something by holding their wrist or their forearm to support them in printing their name, for example. There's a model prompt, which may be us showing a student how to do something before they're required to do it. So if I'm teaching a student to drink from a cup, I may model how I hold the cup with two hands and how I place it into my mouth without sticking my tongue into the cup while I'm drinking. That may be my model prompt. And then the student takes a turn to drink from the cup, a different cup, of course. A gesture or point prompt where we're pointing to something to bring a student's attention to it. Or we might be gesturing to something. So for some of my students where I'm teaching them categories, they may sort a bunch of different category flashcards, and I'll point to a group of cards with my finger like this and say, what are these? That's a gesture prompt. There's also verbal prompts where we might tell somebody what to do. So I may say to my student, here's the bin, put it away. And as the student's walking away, I might say, put it on the shelf, but make sure you're quiet. Mom's resting in the other room. That's a vocal prompt. So I'm telling them what to do, or a verbal prompt. We try to minimize the use of verbal prompts when we're teaching, not only in home ABA programs, but at school as well, because verbal prompts are very hard to fade. It is much easier for us to fade something like a gesture prompt or a model prompt than a verbal prompt. When you're telling somebody exactly what to do verbally using instructions, they can become dependent on that to complete the instruction or the routine. So it's much better if we can point to things instead of saying them. So for young learners, so I have a student right now learning how to brush his teeth. I told mom and dad to point to things instead of verbalizing them. So if he needs to get toothpaste, I tell them to point to the toothpaste. And if the student isn't always paying attention, the point to the toothpaste might look like this, where you're tapping to point to bring the student's attention to it. So they're doing their whole routine by mostly pointing or gesturing. And that's going to help us fade out those prompts. An echoic prompt. So this is the same as an echoic that I just talked about in terms of verbal behavior. So an echoic prompt might be where you notice a student needs help tying his shoes. So you might say to the student, "Help me, please." And the student needs to say back to you, "Help me, please." So that's an echoic prompt. Visual prompts. There's a visual prompt for you right there, an arrow at the start of a trail to tell you which direction to go. It's a visual prompt. Other visual prompts. For ourselves, we write ourselves lists, sticky notes. Those are visual prompts. I have a visual prompt on my door to remind me to set the alarm when I leave the house. It's a visual prompt. We may have visual prompts for our students too, like visual schedules. A token board is a visual prompt. When you have all of your tokens, that visual prompt tells you that you get a break. And then text prompts. So text prompts can be things like us writing words on a cue card that we want a student to say, or writing a word on a cue card to help a student sort flashcards on top of that cue card. So like a category name like food. We write food on a cue card and the student puts all the food pictures on top of the food cue card. So those are some examples of different prompts. There are lots of different prompts out there. Some of these prompts have different names as well. So if you ever come across a certain prompt type when you're reading something, or your provider suggests a certain prompt, don't hesitate to ask your provider what that prompt looks like or what it means. So prompts and tactics are faded as the student learns the skill and develops more independence with demonstrating the skill. Again, fading means reducing or removing slowly. So a skill like walking safely, we start with a hand over hand prompt. We hold hands when we walk. Then we move to a partial prompt at the wrist. Then we move to a partial prompt at the arm when we're walking with the student. Then we have a partial prompt at the shoulder where we hold on to the student's shoulder. Then we have a gesture prompt where we say, "Walk beside me," and that means beside. And then we have an independent response, perhaps, where the student will just walk beside us and walk safely within the community. So that's an example of how you can fade prompts. Okay, another tactic that we use is called shaping. Shaping is when we're teaching a new skill or increasing a pro-social or adaptive behavior by teaching the skill or behavior in steps. Positive reinforcement is provided for approximations of the behavior. Translation, a highly preferred item or activity is provided for improvements in the target response or the target behavior. So an example of this is teaching a student to request juice. First, we would reinforce the sound j. If the student produces the sound j, we will give them juice. Once the student has mastered consistently saying j, we're going to only start reinforcing the sound ju. Once the student consistently requests using the sound ju, we only reinforce the word juice, or a close approximation to juice. And that's what we would reinforce. Then we would provide the juice. The number of steps required to successfully shape a response varies from learner to learner. So this isn't the teaching sequence I would use for every child to request juice. I may break it down even more, or maybe the terminal response or the end behavior that we are going to expect from this student is just saying the sound j. That may be their end response to request juice, and that's okay. It varies depending on the learner. Okay, so as we wind down the talk here, I have a few more terms I'm going to go through, but they aren't as in-depth as some of the other concepts we've talked about today. But I've included these terms because I think they're just important for you to know what they mean. So maintenance. Maintenance is maintaining a behavior or skill over time. We need to fade out contrived reinforcement, which we talked about earlier when we're switching from continuous reinforcement, which is where we reinforce every occurrence of the behavior, to more intermittent reinforcement, where we're not accessing reinforcement every single time we do a behavior. Practice the behavior or skill in a setting different from the teaching setting, and practicing the behavior or skill with a different person from the teaching setting. All of those things are going to help us maintain the behavior that we've taught. Generalization. Generalization is when we use the behavior or skill in a setting different from the teaching setting. Examples are social skills, community safety skills, and school readiness skills. So in our home program, we may teach school readiness skills like packing your backpack, writing your name. We want to generalize those to happen outside of our therapy room. We want to teach Jimmy to pack his backpack in his kitchen, where he's actually going to be packing his backpack when he goes to school. We want to generalize the setting to be the natural setting where that student's actually going to use that skill. So a few miscellaneous terms here. Stimulus. Stimulus is something that is presented. It's an antecedent, a flashcard, a toy. Those are all examples of stimulus. Stimuli are multiple things presented. So multiple stimuluses is stimuli. So 3 flashcards or 10 toys, those are stimuli. So your BCBA may say, hey, we need to pick up some more stimuli for his 3D matching. That just means you need to pick up some more random 3D toys from the dollar store for your child's matching program. That's just what we call stimuli. Field of, you'll see this written in your child's program binder probably pretty often if they're using flashcards or doing some kind of matching task. If it says FO and then a number, that means how many stimuli are presented in front of your student or your child. So if we're using a table to teach a task, it might say field of 2, which means field of 2 flashcards on the table. So the BI will have 2 flashcards on the table when they're teaching the child how to match pictures, for example. And then random rotation, or RR, in our programming can mean mixing the stimuli. So mixing all of the animal flashcards and presenting the animal flashcards randomly during a program. That's what random rotation means. All right, so a few final thoughts. There is no right amount of parental involvement because every family has different needs. Ask questions and seek clarification from your provider. As BCBAs, we have an informed consent process that we must adhere to. Parents must fully understand the scope of the treatment and the recommendations that we are providing. And we need to provide those things to you in ways that you can understand. You're not expected to know all of the terms I presented here today. I think it's amazing that you're here listening to this talk because you're going to be able to pick up your child's program binder, participate in team meetings, and understand all of these things a lot more. But it's not required that you're an expert at these things. We're supposed to be experts in explaining these things to you so that you can provide informed consent for the services you are receiving. So ask your provider to clarify if you don't understand what they're recommending or what they're saying or what a program says to do or what you've seen a BI do, ask. We don't take it personally. We want to help you. So please just ask us if you're not sure. Request training from your provider specific to your child's treatment plan. So when I start up a new team, all of my parents, whoever wants to come from the family, shows up for the initial theory training. Everybody learns about ABA together. I provide that training to the parents, and then as much as they want. If they want to do 5 2-hour sessions with me and go through every program in their child's program binder and learn every single term, I will sit there and do that with them. Not all parents want to do that or have the time to do that, and that is okay. But you can request that training from your provider. and your provider should share that information with you. So I have a few references that I included in my presentation today. Some of these are books, but some of them are papers. If you would like access to any of the papers, you can contact me and I will send you a copy of the paper if you'd like to read it. And come back for more. I will have a spot for questions in just a minute, but come back for more. June 1st at 7 p.m. we are talking about data collection and data analysis. And June 8th at 7 p.m. we are talking about applications of database measures, pre and post diagnosis. I'm so excited for those too. And if you have questions, you can ask them now, but you can also contact me at elizabethgoldstone.com if you have questions that you want to ask me about this presentation, or if you want copies of the articles. I am happy to connect with you.
And if you do appreciate this workshop and you would really like to share with other parents, when we post our next one on the Facebook page, they might already be up there as events. Even on this one, just write a comment of what you learned from it. We will have a video out for it. So I imagine we might be providing that through Facebook or something. We'll see. I'll have to discuss that with Elizabeth. But invite people to the next one. That would be great. So someone is asking, is R&R, reference and regulate autism intervention, ABA based?
That is a good question. It is.
I think I saw that in that article that just came out. We just posted an article from Psychology Today that did mention it as a tactic in ABA, one of a way it can be used in ABA. And I think with all of these things, even something like the early Denver model or floor play, so on and so forth. I think what's important there is that it is done by somebody who has a BCBA background, because I think it's that reinforcing the behavior that's so important, that understanding of that way of being able to design programs around those things that make it more effective. You can actually look up reference and regulate on asatonline.org, I think it is. I'm just going to type it in here. Oops. satonline.org, and they that's an organization that's the Association of Science in Autism Treatment, and they look into what other treatments are out there and talk about the science behind them, plus they sort of describe what they are. So you can look into other things there. It doesn't seem to be turning into a website, so I'll have to double check that. Any other questions while I try to double check that? Hang on.
Yeah, that's a really great website. I love it and refer parents to it, but I also don't know it off the top of my head. It's in my bookmarks.
Oh, it's asatonline.org. That's what isn't that what I wrote? No, I think I just did. Let me just look again here. ASAT, yeah, that's what I did. Anyway, that might be it, so it should work. Just doesn't look like, it's not coming up as a link for some reason. I'll get the link. That's exactly what I typed in, but it doesn't seem to be. Okay, I'm coming with it. That might work better. There, that's better. So that is.
And like you were mentioning, yeah, and like you were mentioning, I think that reference and regulate is probably just another tool that we can use and pull in for learners that would benefit from that type of instruction, just like acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness and all of those things, that if we have the training in it and we're competent in it and it would benefit the learner, I think those are tools that we can add into their therapy regimen for sure.
Yep. And there's a lot of new variations that can be available. And even in my day, now I can't remember what it's called, where you do things really fast. Do you remember what that's called?
Like fluency training?
Fluency, yeah, fluency training. So that was the big thing when my son was 3 or 4, and I was starting to look for someone that had was able to use fluency training because that was sort of the latest thing out there, and I really wanted to be in on the latest thing. So and it's not something we did use it, we did do it, but I don't think it's actually a huge thing, a huge part of ABA now. It's just not the big end thing. But the importance is that a behavior consultant might recognize that fluency training might help increase a child's ability to respond, like to right. So there's a reason why you would do that, but you don't want someone that only does fluency training or only does R&R, or only does whatever. So the broader the BCBA's training is and supervision, the more they've got stuff to draw on. And I want to go back to what Elizabeth said about making sure you ask your consultant things and ask for explanations and stuff. And sometimes I would even say, why are we doing this program? And they would explain to me in psychology terms, research terms, why they would be doing it. And then I'd like, oh, okay, I get it now. Then I feel good about what we're doing. So it's quite helpful if you do ask them that sort of thing. And if they can't give you a good reason, then you might want to say, well, maybe we don't need this program. I was helping a parent who had a consultant wanting her son to practice during school hours taking the bus. And the child had no problem going on a bus, was never going to be on a bus by himself because he was not able to be alone. And there was absolutely no reason to practice being on the bus. But the parent was just going along with this, and the school didn't want to be doing this, and I asked, well, why are you pushing for this? Why is it important to you? And the parent couldn't give me a reason. So make sure you do ask, why are you doing something if you don't understand why.
Yeah, and you don't have to agree with all of the things that we recommend. If there's something you're not comfortable with or that you don't want us to do, tell us. You don't have to agree to everything. It's just like seeking medical treatment. Your doctor may recommend that you take some medication and you can say no, and it's the same thing with us as well. We don't take it personally at all.
But do understand that the behavior consultant lots of times does understand why something is going to help that child get to the next level of something. But if you're targeting, like you were talking about, a behavior and you don't see why you should target that behavior, then definitely ask about it. We have a question here. I know a couple of families with autistic kids who are still waiting in the list to be diagnosed. Is there a way to get this done faster? The only way to get it done faster is to go privately. And there are many companies out there that can do an assessment. If you have extended benefits, they can put a lot of those costs onto the extended benefits, but it will still cost like over $1,000. But you're going to be getting, if your child's under 6, $22,000 for that child's benefits. So it's worth it to try to get the private assessments done. And if you want to know where to do that, I recommend you join our closed parent Facebook group and ask, because things change all the time and the parents will know what the latest thing is. So so just ask on there, where's a good place in Vancouver or where's a good place in Surrey to go get an assessment. It doesn't really matter where you get the assessment done. You phone around, find out who has sooner availability, but don't feel you then have to use that company to have your BCBA at or your behavior consultant at. So some companies do assessments in order to attract you in, but they may not have the best behavior consultants. The assessment part doesn't matter too much unless they're very high functioning, in which case you might want to be careful that they really do get properly assessed. And I would say the one company I would recommend is Able Clinic. And they are in the Pacific Autism Family Network Center. I'm just going to type them in. If you just type Google Able Psychology Clinic, anything like that, and they'll come up. They are in Surrey, they're in Richmond at the Pacific Autism Family Network Center, and they're in North Vancouver. And they actually hired, because of the backlog, they hired retired people just to get this backlog of assessments done so that parents could access that funding a little faster.
Mhm.
And I'll when
And I think the other thing,
Mhm.
sorry to add to that as well, is that if you suspect that your child does have autism, you can contact a behavior analyst prior to diagnosis as well.
Good point.
Um, the treatment isn't covered by the government funding that you will get after diagnosis, but for those that wish to start therapy before diagnosis, there are many BCBAs who will take on families prior to that diagnosis to start that early intervention.
Good point. When we started ABA with my son, which is 22 years ago now, we had no funding at all. We had to pay for the whole thing, and we had to fly consultants in from the US. So things are a little bit nicer now, but you do not have to wait for a diagnosis to start an ABA program, to start gathering a team together. I'm just putting in now the closed parent Facebook group, great place to ask questions as well, and but get feedback on behavior consultants that are out there, and also ask about where can you get a diagnosis done. Okay. So I look forward to seeing Elizabeth and Erin, the rest of you, in about 2 weeks, I think. June 1st is it, our next one? And yeah, we'll continue on, and please share the world. Everybody's share the word, everybody, and everybody's leaving. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, and we'll see you again soon. Okay, talk to you later.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the meeting.
Bye.
Bye.
Awesome.